So we're going to move into the report outs from the breakouts. I think all the breakout leaders got 2 slides. Is that correct? 3 slides. Okay. So the idea is to summarize your report outs in about 5 minutes or so. That will leave maybe a little more. I'm getting a nod and a wink from Terry. Maybe we need a little bit more time for the report outs, but we also want to have, again, a discussion with the larger group to, in response to what the breakout leaders are talking about. So with that, we are ready for group 1. Who is Joyce or Daniel or both? Okay.
Okay, morning everyone. So we had, in some ways, one of the simplest mandates of the groups. Our goal, as we understood it, and as Terry confirmed to us, was to discuss the possibility of creating a registry of cohorts. So this is primarily focused on the idea of sharing cohort-level metadata, that is information about the cohorts rather than the underlying individual level data. And then we had a little bit of time at the end of that discussion to explore what is obviously a much more challenging possibility of working towards some kind of unified database of individual level data across cohorts and starting to think about some pilot projects that might push us in that direction.
So the first question that we put to the group is what data they would like to see in a standardized registry of cohorts. So some of the use cases that we were thinking about is, if you're a researcher, how do you get access to more data to study how a particular exposure relates to a particular outcome or to perhaps replicate a finding? And also, if you are running a cohort, how do you participate in the registry with a minimal amount of administrative burden? So the group proposed a tiered structure in terms of how much data each cohort would share. So this has the advantages of servicing what's available in each cohort to promote collaboration so that people know about each cohort and what's available. Where possible, we want to be able to leverage existing metadata collections. This is not the first time anybody's thought of doing something like this. So how can we take advantage of the efforts that have already been done as opposed to duplicating things? The advantage of having a tier system is that each cohort can contribute information up to the tier that they're comfortable or capable of, depending on whatever restrictions they might have. And also this makes it queryable. So having a place where people can go in, do a single query across multiple cohorts in a structured way to reduce the amount of effort that it requires to get access to these data. So broadly, we looked at multiple different tiers. Tier 0, so many of the cohorts already have their own websites, and so really just aggregating, which is largely what's already been done for the program book here, at least surfaces that these things exist. Tier 1 would be essentially a cohort description, which again is, I think, very similar to what's already in the program book. The ascertainment scheme, the study design, what data types and biospecimens are available. We talked about sharing consent in the entire consent document, if possible. What your data sharing protocol is, and mechanisms and requirements for gaining access to the data. There were differences across cohorts in how they wanted to be approached, so this is an important piece of information to share. Tier 2 would be data descriptors. So, for example, what demographics were collected, what data collection instruments were used, how the data were collected, also what omic data available and a description of that. Tier 3 would be a little bit more effort. These are actual counts. So we could imagine tables of counts from the cohort. For example, how many people have a particular phenotype, or how many people have provided urine samples. Since these things can change over time, we also talked about how, one, it's a little bit more burdensome, and also how it could be updated periodically, perhaps once a year, once every 2 years, sort of dependent on what makes sense for that cohort. And then tier 4, which we discussed very briefly at the end, would be sharing actually individual level data in the registry.
So obviously there are a number of challenges that arise with building such a registry, and we went through a few of those during this session, and we may well have more in the discussion section this morning. So the first point, which was made emphatically and repeatedly, was that fielding inquiries and doing analyses across a cohort, even to build up information about a cohort, even not necessarily doing detailed scientific analyses, is something that doesn't come free. It requires analytical resources to actually collect that information systematically across a cohort. And it's important to think about exactly what resourcing would be required and where resources would come from to be able to collect that information. We also spent a little bit of time discussing the degree to which such a process could be automated, or the degree to which some kind of centralized registry could help to take the burden of collecting that information, detailed information from each cohort, off the cohort's hands themselves and into some sort of centralized effort. We also discussed the fact that data sharing models vary often very substantially by cohorts. And so in some cases, data sharing requires one-to-one collaborative relationship building. In other cases, there is an environment where data is released very freely and individual investigators can take advantage of that without further interactions with the cohort. And it's important to be respectful and to understand the nature of those models. We discussed the considerable technical work required to build the underlying infrastructure here to develop, particularly as we started to converge towards the idea of an individual level data sharing. And one point made by a couple of participants was the fact that technology companies have a lot of the skills and resources to be able to contribute to this work. But of course, it's very important that the data not be held centrally by these companies, and that was, I think, very clearly held. And secondly, that the governance of such an organization needs to be global and independent. There was some discussion of language challenges. We had a number of individuals in our group who ran biobanks from countries where English is not the first language. It would be very important to figure out how to deal with that. For instance, who takes on the onus of translating consent forms. And finally, and importantly, there was a clear emphasis on not duplicating existing efforts. There have been multiple groups that have already taken on the tasks of collating metadata, and we do want to make sure that we learn those lessons and take advantage of that data rather than repeating that work.
So we talked briefly about how we might move towards sharing individual level data from cohorts. I think one of the first things that became clear is that even just storing the individual level data poses far greater challenges than storing and sharing the cohort metadata, including limits on data leaving particular countries. We also talked very briefly about the particular difficulties of phenotype harmonization, which I'm sure are being covered by some of the other breakout groups. And also how ultimately federation and cloud-based storage seem like the best option, so that data can be stored in the location that is, like conducive to that particular cohort, and other people can potentially come and do their computation there. We also talked a little bit about how there's really two separate issues here. One is where the data need to be located, which different cohorts are going to have different requirements for that, and also separately governance, right? So you may have fewer requirements about where the data are located, but every cohort is going to have its rules about how they feel the data should be governed.
The final discussion was around the types of projects that such a registry could facilitate. And obviously these projects will differ depending on the exact scale and ambition of such a registry. One point that got a lot of enthusiasm from the group was the idea of building a reproducibility network, given the NIH's and other funding organisations' current focus on reproducibility. This resonated strongly, and here the idea was that if an association was discovered in a specific cohort, this registry could very easily facilitate the process of identifying other cohorts that could quickly and easily reproduce that particular finding before it moves forward to further follow-up studies. The sheer scale that's facilitated by the development of a registry obviously also benefits potential approaches to rare diseases, studying rare diseases or rare exposures, where the sample numbers required for study couldn't be obtained from any one individual cohort, but by looking across this registry, you may be able to identify the cohorts you would need to go after to identify a sufficient sample size to actually perform a study. And of course, the other large advantage of a registry across cohorts, and I'm sure this will come up multiple times in the other discussion groups, is that studies that explicitly take advantage of genetic and environmental diversity across cohorts would benefit enormously from having this type of data structure in place. So that was the discussion within our group, and we look forward to further discussion within this session. Is there a mic? Great.
Yes. Matt Gilman. Did you talk about, instead of having a standardized database, a standardized common data model? So as in PCORNet and the FDA Sentinel projects in this country, those are health systems. They keep their own data behind their firewalls. So it's like a cohort keeping data behind its firewall. You create the program centrally. You send the programs to the individual cohorts who return aggregated results. So that obviates the need to share individual level results into a standardized database.
It certainly wasn't explicitly discussed, but I think definitely fits into that general framework of models for federated analysis. In fact, it seems like almost a requirement for making that work. Yeah.
I think one of the points that would be made, I think if we had discussed that again, is where do the resources come from to support that work?
So I'm just wondering if you discussed the fact that most of the governance issues and a lot of the standardization and databasing issues have been addressed for cancer through the NCI Cohort Consortium that's been around for 10 or more years. And that consortium, I know, is very, very, very willing to support these activities and extend to other diseases.
Yeah, the consortium was named specifically, and in fact was one of the drivers behind this sort of general point about making sure we don't duplicate efforts that have already been performed and learn the lessons from prior work. And that seems like an excellent model to take advantage of in moving forward.
So I was wondering if we could ask maybe John Gallagher to comment on the dementia platform, which sounds like a similar sort of approach. John?
Sure.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, so the dementia platform has built an infrastructure to accommodate individual level data. The challenges we're having is the confidence of the cohort PIs to upload the data to the platform, and the ability to reduce the administration costs, or if you like, the transaction costs of managing the data permissions, because obviously the data don't change ownership. It's just we act as brokers between researchers and data PIs. So we're looking for fail-fast criteria for data applications, standardize the ontologies across data cohorts so that it's very easy to analyze multiple independent data sets, and to frankly encourage this culture of sharing, and the fact that if you combine your data sets, you can get much more scientific advantage from it than if you keep your data set to yourself. So we try to minimize the costs, we try to make it easy, and we try to make it transparent. And we're discovering that actually when people understand the principles, that they quite like them, they find them very attractive, but you still have to persuade the early adopters to invest. And so far we have data for 600,000 individuals, and I must say a large majority of that is UK Biobank.
Any other comments or questions? Francis?
Just wanted to ask, in terms of your recommendation that individual level data really is going to need to be in the cloud, because otherwise it'll be very difficult to manage. How does that fit with country laws that say data cannot leave the country? If I wanted to do an analysis of multiple data sets, they were all in the cloud, but they were put there by a specific country. Do I have access to the data? How does that part work?
Great question that I'm totally unqualified to answer. Is there anyone in the audience that wants to speak to that specific question? So it's obviously a critical question for European cohorts in particular. Yeah.
So perhaps I'm trampling on the next breakout group, but that's the purpose behind the federated data system, is that you send the code to the data remains stationary, you're able to pull out the insights or the machine learning, bring it back to the point of origin. So that's one way. It's a very elegant band-aid, I guess, around those restrictions.
One more. You want to say something? No?
All right, thanks.
So can I actually respond to that? So one of the things that we talked about in the policy breakout was the need to understand how many countries actually have regulation or laws like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, if we actually start to entertain this model, we'll have to get some sort of inventory of that.
I think the other question too is that if the data are stored in servers in a particular country and then the computation is done on those servers in the country, then to what extent are the results that you've created on those servers in that country, going to be beholden to the laws of that country as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you need lawyers.
Not
That's
us.
Right. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
So group 2, that's Teresa, Zayas, and Cabán, and Thomas Keane. Will you present or will both come up? Welcome.
So we almost changed the name of the presentation to IT Considerations, a Modest List. Very quickly, the first thing we talked about dovetails nicely off of Group 1's presentation, that it is in order to be able to discuss and think about all the IT considerations in terms of data access and analysis and things like that, it's really important, or job one is to define the cohorts and understand what data are being collected from each cohort, in what format, what the sources are, how they're being stored, and particularly how that varies by data type and strengths and weaknesses of different approaches, as well as the standards being used to store the data or metadata.
Okay, so we had this kind of fundamental discussion about federation versus centralization for these cohorts and the data that they hold, and this kind of dovetails again with the discussion or the question that was made at the end of the last presentation. So which model is suitable for large-scale cohorts? Centralization, there's a reduced duplication of effort. You've got a few centralized repositories with very large cohorts of cohorts. There's a few single points for data discovery and access, possibly more sustainable funding if you've got a fewer number of large resources. This, again, is kind of the discussion that we had at the end of the last session. Some of the reasons for federation, I mean, if there are jurisdictional restrictions on data export, especially as if you think about genomic data as it's entering healthcare, it just may not be able to export that into different jurisdictions. The idea of data safe havens, this is something that's come about again somewhat from healthcare derived data, where it can't leave a particular infrastructure. Enhanced security requirements for storing the data and making it available, and then just the sheer size of genomic data sets. It just won't be practical to copy it around, around the world and around the internet. But then obviously the challenge is that there's a sustainability challenge if you've got many smaller federated data portals, and keeping those funded and actually keeping the IT systems maintained for those.
And quickly, I'm glad, Matt, you brought up the CoreNet and Sentinel. There are other similar efforts in addition to some of the cohorts that have already been generated that we can certainly build on and learn from.
And we said that this federated analysis model, I mean, we had examples in our group where pharma is already working in this model and has been working this way for quite a while, where you request access, you log into another infrastructure, you do your analysis in that infrastructure, and then you export whatever results you're allowed to export. Some of the cohorts already work that way, but for a large part, the current sort of cohort research is not done in this manner. We said that, for this to work in this federated model, you need standardized interfaces. We had some examples from the UK. One is called the Data Shield. The UK 100K project, they're working with the cloud workstream and the GA4GH to try and work on some of these standardized interfaces for accessing and authorizing access to data sets within the compute environment of the UK 100K project. And then one of the goals is that, to have these standardized interfaces, you want to avoid having to rewrite your analysis pipeline every time you want to do an analysis on a different cohort. Okay, so then we kind of went a little bit more into the interoperable analysis. What does it look like? Ideally, you'd like to have a standard set of analysis modules to choose from if you're doing a GWAS, if you're doing a rare variant analysis, if you're doing a risk score analysis. I had a diagram on my slide yesterday where there's kind of this picture from the GA4GH cloud workstream where you've got different sort of modules, different levels and different layers for this, like where you've got a selection of tools, you've got a selection of data object interfaces. There's a whole layered approach for trying to build this interoperable analysis. We did talk a little bit about the heterogeneity of analysis tools that exist, particularly in genomic analysis at the moment. There is this question about standardizing the analysis modules that are analysis tools that are used versus the kind of enabling innovation and development of new types of tools. And this is kind of largely how research works. But then as genomics maybe enters into pharma and healthcare, there was a push to try and just standardize how we analyze the data. And one point was made from the Pan-Cancer project is that one of the biggest variables actually was the sample collection artifacts as opposed to the way the data was analyzed. We talked a little bit about authorization and access for data. I mean, you know, currently, it is a little bit clunky for gaining access and authorization to data sets. We'd like to accelerate that process, you know, using sort of more modern and, you know, you log into your Facebook account and use your credentials then to log into other different websites and infrastructures. But the principle is there. I mean, the scenario is that if you apply for authorization for one particular data set at a particular institute, you go through the full process, the full authorization process, credentials and everything. But then you request another data set at that same institute. I mean, you'd like to be able to expedite the request for further data sets based on the fact you've already gone through a full authorization process. Some of the technologies and kind of approaches for this that are kind of coming about is one is this library card concept where a researcher gains access to other resources based on what data sets and they've already got access for. I mean, this is really trying to move us towards having a researcher ID or a passport that you can present to an infrastructure, and then you got all your credentials and what you've already got access to, and then based on that, on an evaluation of that, then you can get access to further data sets. And then we briefly touched on the idea of this bona fide researcher. I really did not want to discuss this because it's so contentious, and what does it mean, and what is it, how is it determined, can we have a universal definition, and I'm going to leave that there because I don't want to go into that anymore. And then we had a discussion about operationalizing consent. So, I mean, some of the consent agreements, participant consent agreements, you know, have been gathered over many years. They're heterogeneous. They have different interpretations. There is, you know, to be able to go back and look at all those consent agreements and then try to operationalize them, harmonize them, and standardize them, obviously requires a level of funding and effort to do this. There was a question as to whether it's achievable, maybe to try and define some baseline goals. But there is a duty of care for the operator or the provider of the data to make sure that all the access is compliant with the original consent. Mm-hmm. So there is this harmonization challenge, and there are different approaches to this problem. Okay, then we touched a little bit. I mean, some of the cohorts that we're talking about and have been talking about in the last 2 days. You know, some of them are quite have been going for many years, maybe up to 20 to 40 years. There's a huge heterogeneity of IT systems, collection protocols. You know, the different technologies, different. It's you know, you're going back, you know, many years and compared to how quickly technology changes. So the question is how to integrate those older cohort data with these kind of modern sort of federated systems that we're trying to propose. We had some examples of how this has already happened. One example from pharma was with the CDISC FDA format, where the pharma has just had to harmonize on using this CDISC format. We think we're definitely at a similar point for these cohort studies at the moment. We talked about data and metadata harmonization. At the cohort level, there are tools that already exist for doing cohort level harmonization. And yeah, okay. We touched on data discoverability. As you can see, the IT challenges are quite significant. I mean, there's so many topics that we could keep going through. So we touched on data discoverability. You know, how do you search for cohorts by metadata? Do you do it across a cohort level, sample descriptions, data use, sample processing? There's a broad map of content, maybe using ontologies to try and standardize that. Details about individual level variables and phenotypes, sample size, and others. We briefly just said some of the efforts that the GA4GH discovery workstream are taking to try and approach this problem. You know, the obvious three axes here is discovery by genotype. The Beacon network is one example of this, discovery by phenotype. The Matchmaker Exchange network is an example of how this is working. And discovery by data use. We have this data use ontology, and this comes back to the standardization and harmonization of the consent agreements. Okay. Yeah. So again, just coming back to this harmonization process, in particular for data use. there's just an example here again from using the data use ontology to do cohort level mapping of consent agreements onto standardized ontologies, which then can be used then to in the process of data discovery to actually find data sets that you want to do particular research on. If you can do it by ontologies and standardized terms, then it's in theory much easier. You don't have to read multiple different consent agreements. Okay, and then this point came up yesterday about when a researcher applies for access to a data set, that they have to specify exactly, what is the research they're going to do on this data set, and sometimes that's not always possible. I mean, we really want to enable hypothesis-free research, kind of open-ended research across cohort data sets to discover new patterns, make novel findings from some of these cohorts. We want to enable some of the new techniques, such as machine learning techniques, which will just kind of look at a data set and just start to find patterns that a human may not be able to kind of write down in an application for doing open-ended research, because you don't really know what the patterns are you're going to find. So this requires kind of a sort of different request authorization process. There was an example here of this. There's a software called Deep Patient, which is a novel unsupervised deep feature learning method for deriving patterns from EHR data. This was published a year ago. So this is an example of doing this kind of hypothesis-free research on cohorts. And then last slide, we talked briefly about measuring impact. So tracking and quantifying and the reuse and use of these cohort level cohort data sets. I mean, this is extremely important, for funders to see the value of these cohorts and see how they're being used. We talked about a few different approaches for doing this, using DOIs to track the queries that are carried out across this network and cohort of cohorts. Obviously, they can be used to quantify the number of citations. We briefly started to talk about some sort of distributed ledger that maybe would record the use of the different cohorts. Again, that's a whole area in itself, and how that might work. But yeah. Yep.
Thank you. So, are there any comments or questions?
There's one over here.
So, as far as I understand, I mean, what you're proposing, right, is that the researchers would have a one-off access, right, so that you don't have to go again and again each time you have a new question through the entire process. I think one of the challenges for that would be that the specific data sets might be consented in a different way, right? So each time you need to go back and look whether that's allowed or not. So do you have any ideas on how to overcome this challenge?
Well, I think we tried to highlight using this data use ontology maybe to map what the consents in an automated way, to map what sort of research the consents allow, so that you could search for data sets using this ontology, rather than having to reread the consent agreements every time.
Yeah, it seems like more and more cohorts now are having imaging data. Do you have any discussion about how that would work in terms of IT storing and sharing CT imaging or other imaging data?
I think it definitely is a reality that we're having for cohorts there is multiple different assays and data types that are available being collected for those cohorts. We didn't specifically discuss imaging data. There is a question as to what type of imaging data we're talking about, whether images of a set of cells, whether that needs to be controlled access or whether that can be open access, whether it's identifiable, I guess, is the point. I think that's a very active area of discussion. I know at my own institute at EBI, we're actively talking about this and what it means for consent agreements and image data, and what types of images maybe need to be controlled access or not. Yeah, I don't know if we have an answer to it, but it's certainly an active area of discussion.
Yeah, thank you. You guys presented a fairly broad agenda, and you didn't even cover half the things you probably talked about.
IT considerations are huge for this.
So my question is really, where would you start? Year one, there's an opportunity. What's your priority? Because we need to understand that so that we can potentially move forward.
I think we would probably want to join the efforts from the first group to just get what are the cohorts? Yeah. What data do they have? You know, just to get this catalog of what the cohorts that are out there. I mean, I've talked to so many cohorts yesterday and today that I just didn't even know existed. If we could get a registry of the cohorts to start with, and then I would be trying to encourage as many of the cohorts maybe to look at some of the standards that are emerging, you know, for data discovery. Data discovery is probably one of the first challenges, finding the data sets of interest. That's probably I would say that's probably the first challenge.
Richard?
I don't know where or to what group I should put this, but it seems to me that analysing cohort studies is just a much more complicated business than all this sort of data sharing business seems to make it out to be. You know, if I'm working on trying to analyse, get sensible analyses out of a particular cohort, it takes a year, 2 years really to understand one cohort. And you know, when we've tried to arrange collaborations between many different cohort studies, for example, Valerie's collaboration to try to sort out the relevance of hormone replacement therapy to various diseases, it just takes a lot of work with each cohort to understand what they've got, what the particular complications are, how things were done, and in fact also which studies should not be included in the overall results because they are subject to biases. That's not so much a problem with cohort studies, but it is with some of the retrospective studies. And I think a lot of this really needs to be done, you know, the analyses of cohort studies really need to be done in collaboration with people who really know those cohorts, in other words, the people who've actually done them. The idea that you can just grab data from a cohort study and, you know, it's all very well if you're just looking at some genetic variant, which is a little yes-no thing, but it isn't, this isn't right. It isn't going to produce good science. It'll produce superficial science, I think. And I think that I've tried to make this distinction before, and I don't quite know how to do it, between data taking and data sharing. That somehow, if there's going to be a lot of different cohorts contributing to an answer to a particular question, then rather than just say everybody's got to make their data freely available, anybody can take that data and do what they want with it, it would be better to try to have some arrangements where somehow you get shared analyses where those who've actually generated the cohorts are involved in the analysis of serious questions relating to them. So I've spent the last few decades trying to arrange sharing of data between different studies, and we've had some quite nice results, both on treatment of disease and on causes. But every time it's really involved. You know, you've got to actually involve the people who did the studies, because they'll know things about their studies that you don't know. You'll understand things better when you do. And you know, I think we're going to get a lot of superficial stuff if we're not careful, if we don't actually try to make it so that we're actually having data sharing rather than data taking. Nearly all these formulae seem to be, you know, mechanisms for data taking rather than for trying to get analyses of serious questions which actually involve shared discussion and collaboration between the different people who've done these studies. I don't know what the right thing is, but I think the phrase data sharing, as currently used, doesn't distinguish between data sharing and data taking. I'm very much in favour of data sharing. I'm not in favour of just saying, oh, we can just take this, take that, and you know, we'll do the analyses and you know, you're not involved. I think that there are times when that may be essential when the investigators are absolutely impossible, but you know, but I think it shouldn't be the norm.
The last question. Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of add to that comment a bit. I mean, I fully appreciate every one of those points, and you know, I've spent years and years learning the cohort that I work with. But at the same time, I mean, I do think there are actually lots of opportunities to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the way, you know, these long-running, complicated cohorts analyze and access data.
and that there are so many more modern systems compared to the way we've used epidemiologic cohorts for decades, and that I truly believe there are more efficient ways of sharing the data and encouraging use of the data in the most valid, thoughtful ways. And that, if there were the resources, and the funds in place to encourage new systems, for using old data, that sharing could become, much broader and not require, every single investigator at each cohort to be part of every analysis. Because that is, it's not good for the cohorts, and it's not good for the people who want to use the data. There is a happy medium where we can provide, better tools for people to thoughtfully use complicated data.
Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, so this comes back to Geoff's pragmatic point about what would be the priorities. And so I think one of the priorities, as you stated, would be creating what I would define as sort of a metadata dictionary, because I look at this again as a tool, not as a solution to the philosophic problem that was just raised. But the second thing I think is you articulated a number of different efforts that are already underway in this space. And I think the other thing to really do is to try and get a comprehensive catalog of what people are currently doing and how we can actually take advantage of those efforts and perhaps broaden those efforts to avoid what inevitably happens, which is, we have 14 standards, and a bunch of people say, gosh, we need it. We should have another, we should have an overarching standard, and then we have 15 standards. And we just can't really move forward. So those would be the two things that I would say in a one-year time frame would be priorities and would be reasonably attained.
So do you want a last quick comment before we end this part? Thank you.
No, I agree.
So the next group is represented by Geoff and Rory.
I'm afraid I'm on my own. So thanks very much. So we were asked to consider the scientific agenda with short and long-term goals, and there were two specific questions. The first was what enhancements to existing cohorts would most increase their utility and promote data sharing. And then the second was what are the highest priority scientific questions that could be addressed by a cohort of cohorts. And we tended to consider them separately, although they're clearly related, by which I mean that if one can improve and increase the utility of existing cohorts, particularly taking advantage of the fact that the existing cohorts have long-term follow-up, which of course has enormous value in doing things sooner rather than later, then that would also promote the value for data sharing, and particularly deal with the second question around the scientific utility of a cohort of cohorts. So I've underlined what I think we consider to be the priority, but really starting from the first point, the idea of collecting biological samples in existing cohorts. There may be some very large cohorts where there aren't biological samples at all, where there might be specific value in collecting samples in them. There may be cohorts where there are baseline samples, but where collecting additional samples after baseline in order to look at change over time could be very valuable. With UK Biobank, for example, where we're imaging 100,000 people about 10 years after baseline, we are at the same time collecting the same biological samples such that change could be looked at. And of course, there's also the question of collecting new sample types, and in particular, the example given of the microbiome, but also yesterday, the comment was made about what kind of sample one would need for particular kinds of RNA. The second point was around developing population-specific genotyping arrays. These clearly have been developed for a number of populations, but not all populations of interest. And again, going back to that point about the value of having cohorts in a range of different populations in order to be able to look at all sorts of exposures that may well differ in those populations, including genetic exposures, developing those specific genotyping arrays would be likely to require new array design, and that would be facilitated by some whole genome sequencing, perhaps, in certain of those populations, not only to inform the array design, but also to inform the imputation from the array design. There were certainly seen to be opportunities in some of the new omic methods, but also some challenges around standardization and characterization of the data processing, the analysis, the reporting of those methods that would be helpful in understanding the analyses of individual studies and would be particularly important when one was trying to, combine data from particular cohorts. And the point that many people made and felt that should be emphasized, that if one was to take a priority on this slide, it would be around supporting cohort-wide genotyping and other omic assays in order to avoid wasteful and costly case control approaches. So wasteful in terms of depleting sample, wasteful in terms of the time it takes to pull out those samples, and also costly in the sense that if we can get our act together and go to suppliers to do assays on very large numbers, then clearly that can push the price down, as we again saw with the example of UK Biobank and genotyping. And to reinforce that point of taking advantage of the long-term follow-up in existing cohorts. Continuing with question 1, there was the point of, okay, we've characterized the participants. We need to now have standardized approaches to the phenotyping of the health outcomes, the points that were described by Josh, Zhang Ming, and Kathy yesterday, to phenotyping the health outcomes using algorithms based on health record systems, but not only health record systems, other sources, and in particular, the potential value of getting access to tumor samples. And that access may be blocked for a number of reasons now around has one got consent, who owns the samples, will they release the samples for this purpose. Developing novel methods for characterizing exposures, so imaging, image analysis, linkage to environmental and socioeconomic data, education, work, and also novel methods for assessing outcome. Maybe it's time to come back to the mobile technology strategies of not only to assess exposures around the environment, but also for outcomes on, say, cognitive decline, arrhythmias, various other things that we can't really pick up through health record linkage. And the issue of how do we facilitate people's understanding of the data that are in a resource around visualization and management that support both the use of the resource and the sharing of those cohorts. When we came to question 2 around the highest priority scientific questions that could be addressed by a cohort of cohorts, one point that was made was actually there's some really good examples of this having been done in the past. Diet and cancer, hormones and cancers in women, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, endometrial cancer that Richard just referred to. There have been some very good examples of the value of that being done as collaborations between the cohorts. And it's often been done in kind of weekends, evenings, a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, and that maybe there are opportunities to support that kind of collaboration driven by particular groups to address specific scientific questions by combined analyses of the data. So that was one thing where there seemed to be value in the past, but it could be perhaps supported more. To think about producing context-specific analyses of the local relevance of risk factors. So, risk factors that we know a lot about may well have different impact in different settings. Smoking being an example, but I mean, one can think of many others that could better inform global burden of disease and other estimates. And also there was a point about disease not being the kind of opposite of health, but to assess what determines health in different settings. Obviously one of the advantages of a cohort is to address questions that are related to conditions for which there are likely to be too few cases. But the point was also made that there are also settings where there may have been too few individuals of interest in any particular cohort. So studies in young people, studies in various ethnic groups, that might be another area where there would be real value. And that the focus in terms of harmonization or standardization should be on what really matters, not trying to standardize everything, not trying to make everything the same, but kind of focus on what things it would be most helpful to do that. And again, the example that was brought out about the novel omic assay methods, where some kind of standardization may be very helpful. Finally, under our kind of other comments, there were 2 points that we wanted to make. One was supporting the development of systems to facilitate long-term follow-up of health outcomes in lower income populations. So the example of India, Africa, I suppose, as well, would be a good example. But the access that one has, more or less, to health record systems that facilitate this very long-term and comprehensive follow-up of at least some health outcomes. If one could expand that, there are some places where one can do death and cancer. One could expand it to link into hospitalization data. Then that obviously increases the number and the range of diseases that one can cover. But there are other areas where one can't even get linkage to things like death and cancer. So are there things that could be done there? And the second was around facilitating access to the widest range of health outcome data. So they're kind of linked. How do we get long-term follow-up? How do we expand that beyond just the kind of the death and cancer, which has served us very well in the past? But we know we can get hospitalization data, that increases numbers and range. We can get primary care data, that increases number of, and range. And that these issues may well require the engagement of the major research funders with government. This is, to take Camilla's example, it really isn't for the researchers to develop the roads system. And I think that this is an example where heroes and government perhaps could be thinking about how they facilitate these kinds of studies, which would then facilitate meta-analyses of the different studies. And the point that Camilla made about emphasizing the relevance of health research to health care might be one of the arguments that could be made. And also addressing the issues around data protection and the obstacles to actually getting access to these data, even when one has the consent of the participants.
Thank you. It was a very comprehensive introduction to the discussion. Anyone wants to comment or ask questions?
So Rory, just to make that point about Africa, looking around the room, we have absent friends. And I know there's H3 that Jeremy mentioned. I think a lot of that is about, and very appropriately, sort of quick wins cross-sectionally. There's also the in-depth consortium, which is trying to build on the DHSS sites. But doing cohorts in Africa is really tough. Getting the outcome data is tough. Getting the follow-up data is tough. And I think it'd be a shame if in 10 years' time we didn't have several African cohorts here at the table.
And I think that this final slide is really emphasizing that point of, if one doesn't have a system for comprehensive long-term follow-up, then really one can't establish large-scale cohorts.
Jeremy?
Just to disagree with David there on the second, I mean, just to rephrase, not speaking on behalf of Francis as well, but I mean, the key issue of H3 Africa is two things. One is shifting the centre of gravity to where the questions are asked, and B, training the next generation. So to characterise it as a series of quick wins, I think would be unfair to H3 Africa. But maybe I'll hand over to that in a second. And secondly, absent friends absolutely right, but I wouldn't be so pessimistic about cohorts in sub-Saharan Africa. The in-depth network and a number of other networks are actually there and to be supported. So I think it's a mischaracterization of the continent to say it doesn't exist. It's certainly a foundation that can be built on.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, I think a lot of these initiatives like H3 Africa have really built a lot of capacity to do the research and to do the follow-ups. And I think it's that people actually, they exist, you just don't know about it. Because Africa has traditionally been exploited, and so now they're taking ownership. And I think they're doing it in a way that's, everything has to be sensitive to the past histories. But I think just it hasn't been disseminated enough that this is actually happening and is extremely successful. So
yeah, I mean, I was trying to keep it wider than particular projects. I mean, to really think about what are the things that would facilitate these kinds of studies. Yeah.
Have I missed anyone? So, Rory, I wonder if your group talked at all about the environmental measures. Obviously, are challenging. We've been trying to.
Could you put the slides back up, please?
For quite some time.
I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
Yeah. So we've been talking about trying to improve environmental measures for quite some time. Did your group discuss at all priorities for that? And don't say diet, but after diet, because we all agree that that's an important one. Any particular measures that you felt were important? I mean, air pollution is one that's tractable. It may not be as important as some others. So what did you?
Well, there were two aspects that were brought up. I mean, so one was around linkage to data that might get at environment, but there was also the question of can we go back to although there had been attempts 10, 15 years ago to try to develop approaches to individual assessment of exposures. Was this somewhere where actually things have moved on, so it would be worth going back to that and thinking about environmental exposures to air pollution and things on that area?
But in terms of how one would choose those, because as we've said in a number of these instances, we can't solve everything. So where would the needs be? I mean, what would be something that would be compelling, important, that's relevant to lots and lots of different groups? Is air pollution the one, or is there something else?
We didn't go into that kind of specific detail as to which particular one.
Geoff?
The trouble with air pollution is that what you measure now may be nothing like what the truth was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and it's likely to be like smoking in terms of having some of its main effects would involve decades of exposure. It's really not at all easy to get reliable evidence on this.
Different topic. So I think there was a bullet on somebody's slide yesterday with the value of the cohorts, alluding to the fact that this is a tremendous resource to help jumpstart the careers of young investigators. And I'm just wondering if it came up in your group or maybe others about how we can marshal these resources to really help train the next generation of 21st century epidemiologists and people that will need to embrace this when people in this room are no longer here. So that's the question I have, is part of the scientific agenda potentially to have a training platform?
It wasn't something that was discussed, but I mean, again, I think that is true of individual cohorts as well as for cohorts of cohorts, that if you enhance the value of individual cohorts, then people working on those cohorts can do more with them, and it becomes an even more valuable training ground. And We're certainly seeing UK Biobank being used a lot for training. So that's one point. But I think also, the combination of data from different cohorts to address specific scientific questions can also be a very valuable training ground. But to kind of expand on Richard's point, to train people in doing bad epidemiology by just doing superficial analyses would not be a good training ground. So I think that kind of reinforces that point as well.
Yeah, so as part of H3 Africa, actually, there's a lot of training for all aspects of audiences in bioinformatics data analysis, but also now genomic medicine training for clinicians and nurses who are in the clinics. But my comment was actually about one of your other points, that you were talking about the genotyping arrays for different African populations. And just another plug for Africa is that we've just designed a new African-specific genotyping chip, and it's been released now and at a competitive price for African institutions. And there are about 15,000 samples already sort of coming off that. So I think we found it a very valuable exercise, and I think the results are already showing us very valuable. So, and in doing that, we did a complete evaluation of existing chips in African data, and there was a clear need for having a population-specific chip. So I would support that.
Yeah.
I have myself on the list, unless I've missed someone. I would like to return to that underlying point, your main priority, to support cohort-wide genotyping in other omic assays. And I think that is an interesting priority for this group. And it would be interesting to explore what models can you imagine for doing that. And how would you select cohorts? How would you deal with all the others that are already doing genotyping to some extent, or in nested case control studies, etc.?
Well, the point that was made by some, at least, members of the group was that the case control approach, which many are adopting, is one that is adopted because it's really the only way. You have the samples, there isn't the funding to do it across the whole cohort. And I mean, as I said yesterday when I introduced my talk, UK Biobank has been in an extraordinarily privileged position. But I think it's also illustrated the value of doing that because you can't really share sample, but you can share the data from assays. But you also then future-proof the cohorts such that you don't deplete the sample. You don't waste the sample on lots of sets of case control collections that can't then be combined. You don't spend a lot of time pulling out case control collections, which use a lot of time, but it's really the only strategy that people can adopt if that's all the resource that's available. As to imagining how that might be prioritized from the funder perspective, I think that the key thing would be to think about what are you trying to achieve? And I would have thought it's around complementarity, that you'd like to have this available for a wide range of exposures, genetic, lifestyle, disease risk factor level exposures. So it's not something necessary for every cohort, but there might be particular cohorts where it would be valuable. It could be those where you've got very long follow-up, where there are samples stored. There's a quick win for you. You take something that's got a 20-year follow-up, and you take their baseline samples, you can get data about a risk factor on 20-year exposure. So I think it would be having a strategy for which ones would give you the best value.
Just practically as well, there may be benefits of conversations going on after this room in ways that cohorts could work together to negotiate prices with different organisations, which ultimately would drive down the price. And that may also be of great interest to organisations which may, I hate to use the word, feed off that data, if they were backed by very good databases that come with those cohorts.
Yeah.
So rather than each individual cohorts negotiating individually, there may be some benefit of the power of working together.
I think it might not only drive price, it could also drive technology development and the speed at which companies could do those assays.
The other side of price is funding, and as the cohorts begin to coordinate and perhaps harmonize activities where certain activities haven't been done in some and need to be done, or want to enhance separate collections, the traditional way that a cohort finds a resource is the rather slow and painstaking way of going to the one-off funder and manage it. If there were discussions between major funders to try to create a more efficient way for cohorts, because it can be quite slow if you're stuck in the realm of having to go do a two-year process to get the funding to utilize that wonderful negotiated collective price.
I think the other point to make is that although the sum of money required to do a cohort-wide assay may be large, the value may also be even larger in terms of the return, particularly if the data are then available to a very wide range of researchers to use.
And that value may be enhanced if you're thinking collectively.
Yeah, I think we also need to remember that for the companies that may be driving some of this technological advance, the cohorts are not their big interest. Their big interest is beyond the cohorts, in taking the information from the cohorts and the approaches used in cohorts to then apply to the population at large. And that is part of the power of the negotiating position of the cohorts and potentially the funders that support them. Because the bigger prize is the whole community, not cohorts.
Yeah, validating.
I must admit that it's very hard to stop this conversation, but we're sort of over time, but I think I should let it run for a few more. Francis?
Well, just a quick comment. As we're talking about the potential advantages of volume negotiation about genotyping, we should think about other resource needs that a consortium might require. And one that comes to mind is the opportunity to negotiate with cloud vendors to get a really good deal on storage and computer costs.
Yeah, just add one point as we deal with the topics that we dealt with in the first two presentations, the data, understanding it, and then how to use it from an informatic point of view. I think this is an area that's very prime for collaboration with the private sector too. And the interests and needs are very congruent, and I think you'll see that a lot of that can be shared on a broader basis as we develop this together.
So, do you want to comment before you leave the floor? No. No? I think... So we'll move on to group 4, Laura Rodriguez and Gad Rennert. They're both coming up. Oh, there you go. The floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, so I think it's already quite clear that some of the policy issues are floating through all of the different discussions this morning, and also some of you have talked about some of the solutions or proposals for things to already work around, I think, challenges that we were also trying to consider in our group, and we're going to come back to why that early theme is so important in terms of the things that we're recommending as we go forward. So we kind of ditched our questions. We did talk about them, but we're not reporting through them, so we'll go that way. So what we've done is create a list to start with of some of the common challenges from a policy perspective that we see with the explicit focus of coming together as a big C collaboration, whatever that might look like. And then we have 2 slides on what the needs are, of course, and then come back to some of our proposed action items. So just starting with where some of the commonalities are and things that we'll all have to work together. One of the big things was the what's in it for us, whether that us is the cohort or the participants or the public of the countries from which these cohorts are drawn, and really needing to demonstrate that. And again, there's stakeholders within all of this. It's the funders and again, as I mentioned, the participants, the investigators too. And how coming together through a collaborative activity is going to help meet the mission or again, return some benefit. Whether that's public health or something else that might be able to be defined. Also, another common challenge we heard a lot about, both for individual cohorts as well as thinking about us as a collective, was the institutional interpretations of just within our own countries, the local and national laws and regs that we have to deal with before we could even get to a higher level of coming together for international collaborations. But this, again, is an area where the extent of this challenge will be based on exactly how the collaboration is put together. Are we talking about something where it would be more centralized and we might need to have individual institutions or sites approve things? And so there are questions, and again, coming back to our big point later, that are hard to answer at this point without knowing what the it is that we're talking about from the policy perspective. We also, it was very clear from everyone's perspective that there are heightened concerns with talking about sharing samples versus data or metadata, and so that seemed to be something that was likely going to have to be looked at and would take more time to work through, so it might be a longer term goal if it was decided that we wanted to go in that direction. A common issue was the lack of education or understanding about this type of research or research in general or genetics, et cetera, among, again, many different stakeholders, IRBs, policymakers, the participants, et cetera, and that making it difficult for recruitment or explaining why we would be doing the collaborative activities and making the justification for sharing in this way and working together in this way. Issues around the data access framework for each of the specific cohorts. Again, that was mentioned earlier in terms of how would this look? What are the existing policies and procedures for each cohort? Can they go into a central structure if that's even the goal? Can they put data in a cloud? Does that meet their specific regulations? Again, needing to think about what exactly the characteristics are of what we're starting with from each of the cohorts. And how would that impact what we might be able to do? Another question that goes along with that is the data use. What have participants been consented to with regard to what data sharing might happen? Again, what policies are in place, separate from what the consent says, though ideally they're related. What are the policies in place for each cohort around what data use is possible with the information that they hold? And then a question that, again, just needs extra care, and so it was worth calling out, was what do we think about and how would we have to think about this in our own country environments in terms of including particular communities, especially Native or Aboriginal communities, within the data that would be going, and how might there need to be special considerations about how to bring those data into these collaborations. Okay, so moving on to the needs, but also trying to think about it in terms of the potential benefits and putting a positive spin on what we're talking about. As I mentioned, I think the big question that we kept coming back to was, what is it that we're trying to do? This goes back to my slide about the puzzle pieces and needing to understand what your science is so that you can begin to then think about what are the regulatory and legal frameworks which attach wherever you are to achieve your scientific aims, and then how can you layer a structure over it to think about how you would interact in doing this. So, as often happens, the policy people were sitting in a room off to the side, and the scientific groups were out doing their thing, which is great for where we are in this part of the process. But going forward, we really think we need to join those conversations. And this is a long-held mantra from the policy part. But I think that particularly because of how well-developed the existing cohorts are, we're at a point where we can join these conversations, and it would be really helpful and efficient to do that going forward. And policy will be able to, the policy contributors will be able to be much more helpful if we know what everyone is thinking about or wanting to consider. The next step that comes from that, of course, is then being able to make a clear distillation of what are we talking about, what's the collaboration going to be. We think it would be, this goes back to the what's in it for the cohorts in particular, but also for the broader publics they represent for participating and sharing in this way. can we state what the principles are even at a high level? Again, there's a little bit of this it's hard to do before we know exactly what it is that we're trying to talk about and trying to work through, but it is something that we'll need to do. We do need to also think about, and there's just some other suggestions here, which you all can read about, ways you could set parameters at some high levels to help guide this going through. The next one is talking about the utility and need, particularly in countries where there are not national guidelines already established for how to do this kind of work, to have a set of international principles that could inform the discussions with local and national policymakers. This is something that we've stated on here as a to-do, perhaps, but again, want to remind everybody that a lot of work has already been done by the Global Alliance and others that we can look to, which will save you all time and effort to really think about this because it's had a lot of international input already. But this really can help to inform the future policymaking. It can guide interpretation of how to go forward. It can provide tools for those that need to reconsent or those that haven't yet written consents for their cohorts because they're just getting off the ground, to talk about international data sharing and some of the activities that we would contemplate. And also something else that could come out of this would be thinking about the inclusion of for-profit entities. And again, here there are different layers to the considerations here. There's a layer from the cohort itself, and could there be special interests in those for-profit entities for how they might want to use the data that the cohort might have concerns about, as well as just general public opinions and concerns potentially, or not as many concerns as we think there might be potentially, around the inclusion of the private sector, in particular for-profit entities, so not the nonprofit arms, since there are complicated structures in some cases, but really wanting to have some principles for that to guide discussions and decisions for each cohort in their own decision-making about how to participate to guide them going forward. Actually, this was a typo 4, was supposed to be on the next slide. So then other smaller is relative, things to think about is in terms of how can a collaborative effort accommodate the choices that individual cohorts might need to make on their own for certain activities. And I think, again, I heard this referenced in some of the other groups where cohorts were expressing a desire to decide on a project-by-project basis or something akin to that. There's different levels of granularity that you could imagine it coming out at, but making those kinds of decisions for where their comfort level is, where their regulatory structure will let them go, et cetera. The funding sources to support participation, it takes time, it takes people, and it takes money. Therefore, for both of those reasons, to prepare data to be shared, and depending on how this is structured, this could be labor intensive for different queries and how many queries would come, et cetera. And so the need to think about that in going forward, and the need for cohorts to understand what would be possible. Speaking back to the challenge about education and understanding, there was also a suggestion and discussion around common communication strategies and tools that might be able to be developed to talk to the different stakeholders about what this was, what was in it for them, to combat the fear that we talked about yesterday, as well as some today, that people might have about where some of the risk might be. And also just to, in a collective way, try to take things down to the very simple and clear messages of what the goals are, and avoid some of the nuance and the details that we can all get lost in trying to talk about this, which can just add to the fear or the misunderstanding. And then finally here, also thinking about whether or not there was a resource or platform that the group could develop, so that we could share the lessons learned and the strategies to overcome barriers that we've all encountered in our specific environment that might be useful to our colleagues in other countries as they develop and go through certain challenges and phases of their own growth. Okay, so then the last thing that we talked about was trying to think about specific action items for the near term. And we came up with a few to propose for the later discussion and for people to think through. One was, again, going back to this governance description once we can define what the it is that we want to get to, and it may be that we need to do this in phases so that there might be some higher level overarching priorities or principles that would guide the overarching effort, but then as specific projects are identified, we could think more specifically about what the interaction structures would be for that between the cohorts and between different aspects of the ability to participate or not to participate as a cohort. Something else we thought we really needed in order to help contribute to the what can we do prospect would be to add some information on the policy questions to the survey of cohort information that's already been collected. So specific questions around legal and regulatory frameworks or challenges for each specific cohort since they already exist in an environment. What are their current collaborations, just examples of them, what has worked well from them, are there lessons we can learn so that we don't have to spend time doing something that's maybe already been done quite well. And again, really giving us some data basically to go through and pull out where are there commonalities that we could work together on, what are the challenges going to be, and maybe are there some, not early wins, but early pilot projects where we could take sets of cohorts, maybe not the whole body, but sets of cohorts where there is a lot of overlap and similarity, and do proof of principles to try to show what can be gained. That may also help to demonstrate some of the benefit from pooling together that could then be showed to others for larger efforts down the road. Third was more, again, granular, thinking very specifically about things on the horizon in the policy arena. So understanding what the GDPR rule is actually going to look like and what the guidance that's forthcoming is going to mean for international collaboration on this scale, or any scale, I think is a big question for all of us. And then also a suggestion that we might consider engaging with the primary funders of these cohorts to think about, again, this question of benefit and meeting all of our missions and talking to them about the cost and resource issues for sustaining these efforts. And might there be ways to generate enthusiasm and even support for this going forward if we brought all the funders together for conversation? Anything else to add?
I think it's been perfect.
Excellent. I can go home. So.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I can say is really one needs to decide on the model that we want to do, because the question open here is actually across all, let's call it medical issues, and we are in the genomic world. So we really want to tackle the genomic aspect or the gene environment aspect of all these cohorts, and decide on how to do it with this, the issue of governance. I mean, what do we want? I mean, how do we come up with a solid understanding of what studies are out there with good biological materials and good, in parallel clinical or environmental exposures materials that can actually help us proceed with genomic medicine, and rather than trying to just bring together all studies and all issues and all everything. So we need to be focused but understand where we're going.
I also want to invite the rest of the group to add anything to the report out. Okay.
So in the same way that heterogeneity is of value scientifically with cohorts, I wonder whether heterogeneity of policy is actually valuable as well. Since otherwise, if one harmonizes all of the policy, you might end up with the lowest common denominator actually preventing things from happening. One of the areas where I see this is around people's perception of the views of participants, and perhaps contrasting that with the views of patient advocates, which may not be the views of participants. Or when one thinks about how people try to assess the views of participants, at least in my experience, that's often involved the views of participants who haven't been fully informed about the implications of the issues about which they're being asked. So, for example, around feedback, if you say to people cold, would you want to have feedback of data from taking part in a cohort? They will say yes. If you go through saying in most cases it will be uninformative, in the vast majority of the cases it could cause you harm with no benefit, do you want to know about feedback? You might get a different answer. And so I just wonder whether this harmonization in this case could actually be disadvantageous.
I personally agree with that sentiment, and I think that goes into, one, not trying to develop standards or requirements, but some principles that people could get to in different ways, and again, just really to have a baseline of what the goals and priorities are. The other thing is, I think it's at least why I was interested in getting this additional information from each of the cohorts, because then you can identify where there are commonalities. You don't have to go to the lowest common denominator on any one topic, but you can find places where there might be really interesting questions to ask and where there's greater capacity for cohorts to work together in ways that not everyone will be able to do, but we could still all learn from. So
a slight variation on that is if you have the opportunity to have the lowest common denominator not be quite so low, that would be a good thing as well. So did you talk about the potential, since these are cohorts that have longitudinal components to it, that is, you have ongoing interaction in most of these cohorts with the participants, in trying to come up with some interventions that might otherwise really get in the way of some of the studies we would want to do. And so particularly the idea of a harmonized version of a reconsent that would perhaps make it possible to do studies across cohorts that otherwise get all snarled up in slight differences between the original consent.
Absolutely. I think that's part of the tools conversation. If we had some basic principles, we could develop language that people could use either in their own consent for longitudinal interactions or in a specific reconsent for a specific project. And then we would have something that was ready to go, that was common across all of the different people participating in a given project. So I think we should definitely think about doing that.
So it's possible that you may downplay the value of early wins. So there's a lot of stuff to do across every cohort, but there might be some cohorts who can go through every one of these steps early, collaborate with each other, find something that's impactful, and show the entire value of doing this kind of collaboration, even if it doesn't mean that everyone's collaborating at the same time.
I also completely agree with that. I think that's part of again, to go back to my slides, if you think about the onion as a whole, when it's hard and cold, it's hard to see how to get through it. But if you take apart the different layers and can find the ways to work together, again, looking at the information across the cohorts, where can we pull things together to do things with a lower threshold of time and effort required to get going so that we can demonstrate some benefit that can be used more broadly.
Seeing as the goal across many of the different groups in the open initiative is the sharing of data and also developing commonalities and harmonization, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the influencing of GDPR as it's coming into force rather than the understanding, because there's a lot of uncertainty and there'll be a lot of rapid guidance being issued. And then in the GDPR itself, there are many places where there are derogations for member states to make their own rules related to research, and public health implications. And beyond that, there's a conflation of the concepts of treatment and research. So they're beyond understanding uncertainty, which I think is going to be very difficult. And even if we do, it'll be just a moment in time. It's important to get out in front and demonstrate the value of maintaining a unified system of rules within Europe, which has the extra benefit of the fact that so many other governments are looking at Europe as a standard that they want to copy. And that's not just an expression. Chile literally had the same typos as Europe. So being able to get in front and influence in a positive way, I think, would go a long way towards the end goal of of creating commonalities and sharing across cohorts.
And I think our group would agree with that, and we talked about that as influence, and if I downplayed it, it's more just my lack of understanding, not being part of those conversations directly of exactly where we are in the process. But if there are still opportunities to influence in member states or others, again, there's all of the advantages to doing that and being an active participant in those conversations.
Geoff, if I may add, I don't think that we're being judgmental at this point. I think it's important to have the full map of all the cohorts with the advantages they have and with the deficiencies they might have. When we talked about lower common denominator, we said that we do not want to exclude upfront cohorts that were operating under standards that might be different than standards of other countries, cultures, etc. So we want to have it all in there. The only one place where for sure we should not give up on is the quality of the data. That is crucial, and somehow it has to be quantified, mentioned, I don't know how to describe it. But then if you have a map and you know for each cohort what the criteria were for consent, inclusion, whatever, you can then, when you want to do a cross-cohorts analysis or activity, you can choose to include all, some. You can decide to do a pilot with the, high runners and then expand to more. So you have the freedom, but this big table of information is the crucial element that needs to be put forward. And then if other cohorts want to develop and introduce new measures, I don't know, more modern, I don't want to be patronizing or whatever, but then they can have the chance, especially that, again, coming back to the genomic element, many of the cohorts do not have the top genomic data. So here is a chance to introduce, maybe stepwise even, the additional genomic information or biological information that would be needed or preferred for an effort like the one that this group is trying to lead now.
Thank you, Gadi. Thank you, Laura. That was great. So next we're going to hear from the Collaborative Sequencing Strategy Group, Hakon and John.
Start. Yeah, thank you, Geoff. So we were basically charged with these three questions. What kind of sequencing and omics data would be most valuable, and how could this sort of be facilitated, data sharing be facilitated sort of beyond cost points? And what methods and tools are most applicable in terms of sort of getting this done? And we had actually a very diverse group from 9 different countries, actually, multiple cohorts in some of the countries. So it was quite a fruitful discussion and interesting. And before we address the questions, we sort of laid out the theme of what are the key questions that this type of an effort could do that we can't do alone. And what came up sort of on top there was genomic diversity and scale. Genomic diversity obviously is something we can all do to some extent, but certainly not at the scale that this type of a collaborative effort would do. And also exposure diversity for gene-environment interaction studies. You can think of this in terms of air pollution, toxin exposures, and other environmental differences that vary widely between different countries. And then migrant studies, because with modern lifestyles, I mean, a lot of people from different countries, they live in other countries today, and they live in a totally different environment. I can just take 30 seconds to mention that in 1880, there were about 30,000 Icelanders who moved to Canada, to Gimli and Winnipeg area, because there was a volcano that erupted, and you couldn't really live in Iceland. And we have the genealogy of all of these individuals. And there have been studies done now to compare Icelanders for cardiovascular disease, for seasonal depression and other things. And for example, the fish oil in the omega-3 sort of came out of these research, because vastly different and was protected for Icelanders who live in Iceland and eat fish. So I think we can learn a lot from these type of studies that we can only do with this type of a broad-based collaboration. Other aspects, rare disease, obviously we can all work on rare disease, but certainly not at the scale that we can if we all collaborate. And as was talked about by Sekar and others yesterday, the human knockout studies, the null variants, I mean, this is certainly usually extremely informative, and you can do functional studies to validate and test them, but also not to forget that just through Jiva's genotyping and CNV analysis, you can actually find homozygous deletion knockouts in quite a frequency, and I'll mention that number in a bit. PCSK9-like opportunities. I mean, obviously, there are multiple such opportunities that we just haven't discovered because we don't have the horsepower to do it. So unmet clinical need and sort of drug repurposing, druggable genome, these are all themes that sort of came to focus, would potentially attract pharma to help fund these studies, and sort of addressing global problems such as obesity and toxic exposures. As I mentioned, is something this group felt was relevant and important. And these are sort of a few other points that sort of were made, and some of them have been made here already in the previous groups in terms of the cost driving of this type of an effort. I mean, there's obviously a venue to do that. But one important aspect we just wanted to mention is that this group at least felt that, Jivas is not dead yet, and that there could still be a considerable opportunity to discover new things because many of the countries contributing to this effort here have untapped resources. They just haven't been analyzed in that setting. FIVAs similarly could be obviously done at an immensely sizable scale across neuropsychiatric, developmental, and cancer and other disorders. Alcohol-related diseases, I mean, because the impact of alcohol on populations is vastly different. The effect sizes we learned from China studies are much more greater in effect than, for example, what has been reported in US and Europe and other countries. So this is one thing that could definitely be a focus. And sort of question-driven approaches, setting milestones and goals would be important aspect of these type of studies. As I mentioned, functional omics studies certainly one aspect, and the role of microbiome sort of across different ethnic groups, different countries is something we can only address in this sort of larger setting. One sort of resource a question that came up was the value of having a coordinator or coordinators for this type of an effort, and where you, for example, you're interested in a certain particular disease, you would have a registry of all of these studies, and a coordinator can point you to the key studies that would help you with that question, because you may not even have the time to go through that at the scale that this collaboration could potentially be at. And so in terms of addressing the question, what kind of sequencing and other omics data would be of most value for these cohorts, there was clearly a general consensus that whole genome sequencing data would be most valuable, but there was also a realistic view on that this is probably not likely to happen immediately. It will probably take a few years for this to be real. Whole exome sequencing didn't really get a high score. It was felt that this was sort of would vastly be identifying new variants in known genes already picked up by GWAS. But the notion of initially leveraging existing genotyping data and generating genotyping data across millions of samples that have no such data but have been collected and sit in biobanks today would be a value to this type of an effort, and somewhere between $50 and $100 million could actually go a long way to address that. But this would need some whole genome sequencing, obviously, in some cohorts to establish sort of the foundation of the genetic architecture in these countries where such data doesn't exist, and custom-based arrays, as you know, which are very, very inexpensive today, and with the scale can probably do a sample at $20 or $25 a run. And just to mention, again, the homozygous deletions that you can actually retrieve from this data. We just looked through our database of 100,000 kids, and we found 2,700 homozygous deletion knockouts in that data set. So this is, adds on top of the sort of the null variants that Sekar and others presented on yesterday, which would be helpful. And on question 2, this was, addressed in many of the talks yesterday in terms of sort of what aspects of the collaborative sequencing strategy would, could be, how could this be facilitated, and leveraging efforts such as the GA4G8s and other, presentations that were done yesterday, where there already are a coordinated, integrated effort to sort of harmonize data files and minimize batch effects. There's also such effort across all of the sequencing centers in the US, and I'm sure in the UK and other countries as well, where people are sort of processing the data through their pipeline, but then subsequently harmonizing them afterwards, and they've done so very successfully. So this is probably not going to be a huge issue, but the question is sort of what to share, and everybody felt that there would be value in sharing sort of the smallest file data set, would be the simplest, just the VCF files initially, but maybe have access to the CRAM files, which are the compressed BAM files. Low-income countries and sites that have not significant sort of, funding sources to do this, I mean, what kind of an incentive would they have? This was discussed quite substantively, and also in the context not to make the rich richer, but to try to sort of, make this more even, and it was sort of, what would be the incentive that could drive this, and again, funding always, I think, came up as number one, sort of as the key driver. There were some concerns over population-specific variants that individuals could be identified, but again, I mean, this is obviously holds true for dbGaP and all data repository sites, and obviously with policy sort of, adhering to policy standards, this should not be an issue. And the group felt that would be important also for everyone to have access to a limited number of other kinds of omics data, but obviously this would be something that could grow sort of, with time. And on question 3, sort of what methods and tools would be utilized to handle sharing and do this. Again, exome was not really felt to be a high priority, both because of the variability between the different kits and methods that are used. Whole genome sequencing is much more standardized, even though there are different platforms there. There was a mention, for example, that BGI, which runs its own sequencing platform, is sequencing now about 500,000 people, whole genome, and this obviously would become a very valuable resource when ready. File harmonization, again, at the US sequencing centers, the TopMed data, they've now over 100,000 whole genome sequenced. This has worked well, and despite the fact that samples are sequenced at different sites, and there are such other programs that work that same way. Coordination, obviously, across these different groups. We discussed sort of the potential need for a charter or some sort of a document that NatChart or alike that could sort of capture what we are trying to accomplish, and this would be important to have people sort of, review and agree to. We did discuss the issue of sharing phenotypic data, disease phenotypes, and this was, I don't think anyone raised any concerns with that, which we felt was sort of almost unexpected. And metabolome data, if this data could be generated at a low cost, and there seemed to be efforts to sort of, get this done at maybe $30, $40, $50. This would be something people would be keen on doing and sharing across. Now, I couldn't resist. Somebody told me this the other day, that I can assure you that you as leaders are going to get it right after they have tried everything else. I hope we are not there, and we have the help of 20+ countries to make it right. So. I think, John, if you have something to add to this.
I dare not say anything more than that. No, I think it was a good summary. Yeah, thanks.
Well, happy to take questions.
Thank you for this presentation. So when you're combining a lot of omics data, right? So the more omics data you combine, the more difficult it is to analyze it, right, in a meaningful way. So was there any discussion about creating a sort of community of practice on how to best analyze these different dimensions of omics data?
No, I mean, there was discussion about it, yes, but it was sort of more in the context of, everybody having the ability to analyze the data for the disease area of their interest. And, how you go about doing that sort of, would be more perhaps center sort of different. But just sort of this general global access to everybody was sort of what the most value was felt to be in.
Perhaps I'll come in on that as well as a part of a broader point. Basically, we thought that the most useful feedback that we could give to the organizers was that there's broadly two ways of trying to tackle this very big, diverse opportunity that we have. One is to think about it as an agnostic platform. How do we set up procedures, rules, capabilities? The other is to think about it as science, grand challenge-driven questions, perhaps a few examples that could then illuminate the path forward about how such a group could work. And we very much fell on the side of the latter, that it was much more real, much more concrete. There had been other fora that already had discussed this type of global directory approach. How can we get people working together, working back a decade? And we thought that perhaps that what could be distinctive about this effort is to choose a handful of grand challenges that could illustrate both the challenges and the opportunities, and that would be grounded in the need to leverage the diversity across continents and the scale across continents, which is the distinguishing feature of this type of effort. So as Hakon said, the two broad sets of examples, one related to genetic variation, human knockouts, druggable genome as examples, and the other related to exposure diversity variation, such as alcohol consumption, adiposity, smoking, et cetera. which may have important genetic modulators, and that the incentives for having a group like this or subsets of a coalition of willing to work together would be the ability to generate new data, either based on genotyping sequencing, perhaps some targeted other molecular omics, and then to learn together about how this could be done rather than maybe starting with a more platform-based enterprise, which may not be as motivating particularly for the scientists involved.
Can I just ask and clarify, just so I understand your recommendation regarding sequencing strategy, that the focus should be on genotyping, first and foremost, and the development of targeted sequencing in various populations so you can develop a genotyping array and eventually develop a truly global array.
As a tier one, and then sort of down the road, whole genome sequencing when affordable and sort of more amenable.
But the short term is genotyping.
Right.
Data. So we have an example of a BMI analysis where we did an MVP compared to the giant consortium, same number of individuals, about 330 versus 350,000, but it was one cohort versus 100 cohorts. And we doubled the number of loci that we found in the one cohort, and it wasn't sample size, which was the issue. So probably heterogeneity was the issue, probably on both sides of the equation, probably some variability in the definition of, or the measured on the BMI side of the equation, but I think probably more if you look at the 100 cohorts in the giant consortium, there were genotype arrays from multiple vendors, multiple time periods, multiple imputation strategies, which suggests that there might be some need to at least understand, how some of these various strategies for genotyping map against each other. Have you thought about making that an effort to try to help harmonize some of the differences between the cohorts? I mean, it's great if you get price and comes down and people can all begin to use the same platforms, but there's existing data that potentially may have some harmonization challenges.
No, I mean that's a great point, and again, it's sort of the importance is to understand the architecture of the population. So when you sort of say that, well, there were 100 different studies that came in, many of them are typed on a platform which is not terribly informative for that particular cohort. And we would want to sort of, inform that cohort as much as possible through sequencing and a custom-based array that you can subsequently impute and harmonize.
Great. Thank you, guys. Terrific.
All right, could I just ask?
Last but certainly not least is Dan and Eric are going to appropriately talk about the impact of all of this.
After all that, I'm not sure what we're going to say that is going to be a surprise to anybody. So we'll. One of these is working. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Oh, got it.
That's the link.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's what I wanted. So our brief is to talk about translation and clinical impact, and we were asked two questions basically. One was opportunities in this space, and the other is barriers in this space. Some of the things that you see listed on the opportunities slide could easily be on the barriers slide, and vice versa. But I think you've heard most of what we have to say. The opportunities are to advance medical practice in ways that are listed on the bullet slides, including Mendelian disease. We haven't said much about pharmacogenomics, but that's always on the list, and I guess it's there because I'm here. And then we heard from Sake about the potential of genetic risk scores, and we'll come back to that in a moment. There's obviously a drug development opportunity that we've talked about a lot, and I don't think I need to amplify on that right now. The bullet points say it, and we've heard about PCSK9 more than once already this morning. There's a category that we call generic opportunities because they didn't fall into an easy category otherwise. So there is an opportunity to use this kind of set of resources to increase health literacy and public understanding. And the public is not just the public, but also our funders, our regulators, and our when I say our funders, I don't mean the NIH, I mean the people who fund the NIH. So our government representatives. There is an opportunity for teaching at multiple levels. And then as we get better as a community in terms of understanding how to mine these very large resources, particularly with respect to electronic health records, but other kinds of resources, we should be able to get better in terms of harnessing those to answer simple questions using large, simple trials and the so-called learning healthcare system approaches. So as a community, we're getting better at that, and I think that that's one of the spin-offs of that. And then at some level, we're going to have move from understanding new biology to making new policy. The examples of smoking, of trans fats, of folate have been discussed, and we could see other things coming out of this. In some countries, for example, the identification of individuals who carry, who are heterozygotes for Mendelian disease may have implications for marriage and matings, so to speak. So that's the opportunities as we see them. The barriers are listed here. I feel an urge not to read them, but I'll probably just sort of go through them and comment on some of them. The barriers are the healthcare delivery systems that we all operate under that are all different. The disparities, which of course are also an opportunity as well as a barrier, and the lack of diversity in present data sets. We need evidence for clinical utility for the people who are outside this room, people who have not yet drunk this Kool-Aid and who need to have more evidence that implementing some of our discoveries will make a difference in terms of healthcare and won't increase costs. There is we had a fruitful discussion of the problem of the handoff. That is, there are people who are expert at data generation, and then there are people who are expert at implementation, and those are not necessarily the same communities. And so we need to make sure that we develop methods to encourage both communities and the crosstalk between those two. There are regulatory barriers at many levels. Behavioral change is a barrier, reimbursement, clinical costs, privacy we've talked about already this morning, varying ethics approvals and consent mechanisms, and then a term that Kathy Sudlow introduced to us, and it was academic territorialism. So if we have, for the sake of argument, 25 biobanks or cohorts represented here, some of them are very large, the 900-pound gorilla in the room, and some of them are small and may feel threatened. It may feel like the large biobanks are saying to the smaller ones, well, just give us your data and we'll take care of the rest of it. And so we have to have a way of making sure this process remains democratized and making sure that this doesn't become a barrier. And then there are perceived barriers around engaging industry. We had an interesting discussion about this because one view is that many of the barriers are in fact perceived. They're not actually real. We couldn't possibly do that. Our participants don't want us to talk to industry. And in fact, if you go and talk to the participants of the cohort, they say, fine, you go talk to industry because that's why we developed this. So there's, obviously there are potential cumbersome regulations around interacting between cohorts and industry. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to sort of build artificial barriers around those relationships, because at the end of the day, we do need partnerships. Somebody's going to have to pay for some of this, and it's not all going to come from the US Congress or from the UK government or the Estonian government or other governments. So we, like other groups, thought a lot about potential exemplar projects. The early win is important for something like this, demonstrating how this would work and demonstrating the value of aggregating multiple cohorts, the cohort of cohorts idea. So one was the International Human Knockout Project, analogous to KOMP. We thought we would create a catalog that includes not only whether people have individuals who have knockouts, but what are the other possibilities that are presented by those individuals? Can you recontact them? do they have electronic health records that can be then interrogated to identify phenotypes that are associated with the knockouts, the so-called phenome-wide association, PheWAS approach? And then do they have capabilities, or are they willing to engage others in the basic biology of looking at the phenotypes that we get? And then there are, in fact, issues around establishing that a gene is actually knocked out when it looks like it's knocked out. So, and then the opportunity or the barrier is who pays for that. And it felt like that could be easily, not easily, but that could be a public-private partnership. A second exemplar project would be to standardize the implementation of some of the results that we developed, specifically the return of results. So we recognize that return is influenced by local practice and local culture and traditions, but there ought to be ways in which we can share communication of risk, and it would be important, obviously, if we did that to capture outcomes as well. And we thought that it would be reasonable to start with, for example, cancer risk, figure out how to inform people, how to decide which variants are important, how to inform them, and then look at outcomes, including costs and who gets screened and what gets detected. FH is another example. We could start there and move on from there. And then the third exemplar project plays on an idea that we've heard somewhat about in terms of genomics, or in terms of the environment. We thought we could create cohort-specific risk prediction using standardized methodology. So what we mean by that is that currently we predict coronary disease, for the sake of to use an example, using a Framingham risk score or something like it. People are fond of saying Framingham risk scores were developed in 6,000 Boston Red Sox fans and may not apply across the United States, let alone across other countries. So there are clinical risk factors, and then there are genomic risk factors that we heard about from SAKE in terms of genetic risk scores, and figuring out ways of developing better predictors that integrate both the genomic and the non-genomic approaches, and do that in a uniform way so that we can compare what works in one country versus what works in another country. It would be nice to have the same approach and then see whether there are differences in, for example, the genetic architecture of coronary disease across ancestries across the world. So I think that's what that says. And obviously there's an issue or an opportunity with data sharing, either across cohorts or across individuals. Eric?
No, in the interest of time, I think we need to get questions.
Yeah, some questions?
Mark.
Yeah, something to say, of course.
Mark was in our group, so.
I'd like to make a semi-friendly amendment to number 2. I think standardizing implementation is illusory because it always is local. What I was trying to convey was standardize the study of implementation of return of results.
Okay.
Using the tools of implementation science and frameworks like REAM or CIFAR or those sorts of things so that we can learn from different implementations what works and what doesn't. So I would just amend number 2 to reflect that.
Accept it.
Maybe I'll ask a question. So I'm guessing that across the cohorts, there are some cohorts that are completely decoupled from healthcare delivery systems, and then there are others that are more tightly coupled to healthcare delivery systems. And can we identify that, particularly that latter category, which would seem to be an engine for doing some of the strategy you're talking about? So can we, I don't know how to categorize cohorts in that regard, but for example, Vanderbilt.
Right.
You know Vanderbilt, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a place where where some of the findings from the cohorts themselves could also be the basis for an implementation strategy. So did you discuss that at all?
No, except we didn't discuss specifically the diversity of cohorts, although we recognize that not every cohort is designed the same way. So there are some things that are easily doable. They're doable. in some environments and not doable in other environments. So the availability of electronic health record data or healthcare data in general is one example. We didn't dwell on that. Obviously, one early activity of a cohort of cohorts would be to catalog exactly which cohorts you have and what capabilities they have and how many samples they have and what they've done with them and what ancillary information, including healthcare information and other omic information, would be available.
And what they might be able to do going forward.
Right. Terry, this time you can speak.
Thank you. So we heard yesterday, I believe, from Rory, the value of linking sort of continuously updated estimates of individual risk and health behaviors in neighborhoods populated. So the Mexico City example was a cogent one. Did you guys talk, and we might talk a little bit more about what that was, but basically that it identified a public health intervention that could be rapidly implemented. Did you guys talk at all about how we might be able to use the data being gained from these cohorts to really rapidly implement these kinds of things? I mean, we've heard about learning healthcare systems, but in a more direct route. I mean, do you just call up your health minister and go to it, or?
I would defer the answer to that question to Rory, but I mean, I think that so we didn't specifically talk about that except to say that at some point all of this new knowledge has to be morphed into new policy and new ways of delivering care. That's the end game for all of this. It's either knowledge for knowledge's sake or better care. One of those two, preferably number two. So we think that there are ways of engineering healthcare systems to actually generate that new knowledge in a perhaps not an RCT fashion, but in a learning healthcare environment that allows us to interpret the data. And what we had advocated was to do this to try to create a uniform framework so that we could look at risk, for example, across, for example, those three data sets there, and I don't know why I left those listed there. There are many others, but you could imagine that each of those would develop, using a common framework, could develop different risk predictors for common diseases, and then it would be interesting to look at the underlying biology around those. And it would be also interesting to implement those, and those are two different things that the cohort of cohorts could do. I'm getting better as a politician. I think I gave a long answer, and I didn't say anything.
I have a provocative question. Not sure it's the right time and the right place.
Okay.
Still, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people in the US, at least, who have undergone extensive genetic testing privately. Can anybody take them all to be a new cohort, invite them to contribute their data anonymously or whichever way, and make a cohort that actually has tons of data in it?
This is, I will defer to 23andMe, but Josh Denny, who's not here, and I had an email conversation about this, because since we work at the same place, the only way we converse is by email, about 3 days ago. So whether we could, in fact, figure out a way of engaging everybody who has their private information and put that into a publicly accessible data set. So we could call it the Personal Genome Project. I'd never heard of that. So, comments?
So, we represent a privately held company that gives people their genetic information, so I figured I might take this. As you may know, we do have our own research program to which we consent people to participate. We have an external IRB. And I will say that people are very interested in participating. About 85% of our customers consent to participate in this research. So at this point, we have over 3 million genotyped customers who are now participating. They answer surveys. That's how we gather most of our phenotypic data, although we have these other objective measures of certain kinds of phenotypes. I think in terms of, so that's a type of cohort. I hesitate to apply that word amongst so many epidemiologists, but it is a collection of people for whom we have information, and we do gather some of that information longitudinally. I think if you had an interest in developing, an external cohort based on that information, there are some groups that are doing that sort of thing already. So all of our customers can download their raw genetic data, as an example, and choose to upload it to any other research efforts or other kinds of applications they want to use it for. So there are some groups, Gonzalo Avocasis has one, for example, where he invites people to upload their data sets, and I'm sure you can upload data sets from other providers like Ancestry DNA or Family Tree DNA, and then choose to contribute to those research programs as well. So, I mean, I think whether you do it in partnership with us or another company, or whether you just go and invite those individuals directly, I think there are certainly opportunities to engage people, and I think people want to be engaged directly as much as possible. They are very interested in supporting the causes that impact them and the people that they care about, and also in hearing what happens as a result of the research.
Okay, let's thank Dan and Eric, and all of you.